Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod and another installment of our 18th century way of war extravaganza and a hotly anticipated, frankly long overdue episode. A certain someone has a book out. And that, to be honest, that's an evergreen comment on this show, I will grant you. However, for a long time, people have been saying, look, when are you doing Alex Burns's book? When are you doing Alex Burns's book? Today, that's when we're doing Alex Burns's book. That's the answer, people. So if you hadn't worked it out already, we are joined by Alex Burns, appropriately enough, assistant professor of history at Franciscan University of Steubenville. If you aren't familiar already, Alex is a guru of kind of North American and European military history in the 18th century. He did a PhD under the supervision of Catherine Aelstad, looking at, funnily enough, the topic fundamentally that we're going to discuss today, because he has turned that PhD into a book, Infantry in Battle 1733 to 1783, available at hellion.co.uk. Link in the description. Don't make me tap the sign about how you need to go direct to the publisher, people. You also may enjoy a Fett Schrift in honor of Christopher Duffy, The Changing Face of Old Regime Warfare, Essays in honor of Christopher Duffy. That was again from Hellion in 2022. So, folks, you love the 18th century stuff. Please do go and buy them. And I just want to do a quick shout out for your podcast, the very exciting venture that you've started up recently with another friend of the show, Andrew Bamford. Folks, go and have a listen to the Prime and Load podcast, because if you're listening to this, you like 18th century warfare stuff. So you need to go and make sure you have some of that in your life. And we will put the link in the description. And you know what I always say, do it for their show, please, because especially in that startup phase, reviews really help in terms of that growth. Please do go and give them a review once you've listened. Also joining me in the hot seat tonight is the redoubtable quartermaster Liam Telfer. Liam, good to see you, bud. How you doing?
I'm very well, very, very well indeed. I'm very excited to talk to Alex about his book.
Alex, apologies for the cack-handed nature of the introduction. Lovely to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's great to be back, Zach. Thanks so much.
So, I'm going to be really well. I was going to say I'm going to be really acerbic, as if that was something different and new to this podcast. I am going to ask you the age-old question that historians love to ask when they're trying to be really unpleasant and needly and make our colleagues feel bad about themselves, which is the so what question, as we call it, the why. And I don't mean it in a unpleasant fashion, funnily enough, but there is an interesting point here about why, I guess, a book on battles, first of all, and why infantry in battles. What's been missing from the conversation that you've now brought into the arena?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we've all, I think, experienced those complaints. I mean, how many, when you walk into a bookstore like Barnes and Noble or Waterstones in the UK, you've got a whole shelf on World War II battles. And of course, in America, we've got loads on Gettysburg. I'm sure you have loads on Waterloo. Why on earth do we need another book on battle? We have so many other things. The last 40 years, historians have been trying to point us towards the new military history, right? Adding logistics and society into the conversation. And to some extent, my answer to that question is, at least in the 18th century, because we've not yet done it well. But perhaps more importantly, all history is a matter of perspective and whose perspectives you're bringing into the conversation. And so my dissertation, which is slightly different, I'd say, but three or four chapters are kind of crossing over, but some of it's new material, was all on common soldiers, and so enlisted men, men in the ranks, the Tommy Atkins of the 18th century. And so essentially what I'm trying to do in this book is tell the story of battle in the 18th century world from the perspective of the enlisted men who fought it. And this is To some extent, we've been trying to do this for a while. I mean, you could look at all the way back to John Keegan's Face of Battle and say he's trying to add qualitative elements into the mix there. This is really trying to do that from the perspective of those non-commissioned officers, from the perspective of those enlisted men who are fighting in European armies, kind of all across the 18th century. And so, why do we need another book on battle? Because the perspective looks a little bit different if you're Tommy Atkins as opposed to Earl Cornwallis, or Brother Jonathan as opposed to George Washington. And so you're trying to get at these enlisted men's experiences at really kind of the core of the book in many ways.
In some respects, it sounds kind of like, finally, people, can we please do the whole history from below thing? So for folks who aren't familiar, like, history from below is this idea that rather than doing the sort of the grand narrative, great men of history way of doing history, which is how people started out, perhaps for obvious reasons, we could debate that until the end of time, but you start off with the big leaders, the big decision making, you tell the story through their eyes and through their actions. Then people kind of, probably in the sort of 60s to 70s, sort of woke up and kind of said, well, look, there's a lot of other people who did interesting stuff. Can we maybe look at them? And so it sounds very much as though, much like other facets of military history, it's taken a while for that memo to find its way down to the military historians, which leads me to a more kind of broader spectrum question, really, in terms of why does it take military history so long to get up to speed? Because I've seen this in my research with legal history. You're seeing it with your research in terms of experience in battle. Why does it take military historians so long to catch up, so to speak, with what colleagues in other niches of history are doing, kind of in some cases like 20, 30, even 40 years before we pick it up?
Sure. I guess I would say it's sort of the curse of being popular, right? Uh, Nothing against all the legal and religious and social historians in the audience who are listening, but there is, again, when you walk into Waterstones and Barnes and Noble, there's a whole shelf on World War II, right? Whereas, in graduate school, I read The Cheese and the Worms and other, because incredible works on social history in the early modern period, but those really haven't reached a popular and broad audience in the same way as military history. I perhaps live in a better and more well-adjusted society if your average uncle was into social history and like the life of peasants in early modern Europe, but they're not. They want to hear about the Battle of Waterloo. They want to hear about Sharpe. They want to hear about what was it like in the Great War, the Second World War. And I think this is drives the interest of military historians and what they write about in some ways. I mean, in social history, in legal history, in cultural history, you're writing primarily for an academic audience. And I'm not here to knock that. That's a very important and scientific goal, right? But in military history, to some extent in political history and biography, you have a popular audience, and sometimes you can reach an audience and tell a particular story by doing it maybe in a more traditional way or a more well-worn way. And as a result, I think it takes a little bit longer for new approaches. Now, people have been doing kind of military history from below for a long time. I mean, you have sort of war and society as a field. I mean, when I took my PhD at West Virginia, one of the fields that you could take there and take a comprehensive or qualifying exam on was war and society. They didn't call it military history anymore. They called it war and society. So I do think it's been in academic circles for some time, but maybe it's taken a little bit of time for books like this to try to get out to a more popular audience, to sort of get on the shelves from publishers like Hellion. And so I mean, I do think looking at the interests of your audience. I mean, we had last time we did one of these 18th century episodes, we had folks in the room with us, who were kind of maybe interested in the perspective of discipline from the perspective of these common soldiers. And so I think it can be done. I think it can be done well. I think it's time we kind of bring this into the conversation to tell this maybe broader story to a broader audience.
Alex, it's great to have you back on. So thanks for joining us. And I want to ask a question that I think quite nicely links to that first question of why from Zach. And I guess it's another why question, really, but this time it's about that sort of periodization. So why does the book start in 1733 as opposed to, I don't know, something like 1740 with the War of Austrian Succession or 1756 with the Seven Years' War? Yeah, 1733, why does it start here?
It's a great question. And yeah, I think for an audience in the UK, in America, it might seem like naturally, well, 1740, I mean, Frederick the Great invades Silesia, right? Takes the throne, invades Silesia in 1741. George Washington gets into trouble, at Fort Necessity in 1754. Or Frederick the Great invades Saxony in 1756, starting the Seven Years' War. These are all big landmark moments, right? That we're all very familiar with. And if it was, I was writing, general military history of the mid 18th century or a history of Frederick II or the British Army, I probably would periodize it in maybe that more traditional way. But what I'm writing here is a history of battle. And so this these battle experiences, I think in the mid 18th century, you can draw some through lines or continuities starting in a war that is kind of unfamiliar to an English language audience. The War of Polish Succession. I mean, it's, people in America are like, what on earth are you talking about? In the UK, maybe you might remember a bit of this. The UK wasn't directly involved, or Great Britain at that time wasn't directly involved in this conflict. It was the sort of the French squaring off against the Habsburgs in northern Italy and other parts of the world. The Russians are sort of fighting in Poland itself. But looking at references to infantry combat, especially in the French army, I see a lot of when I was preparing for the book, and really when I was working on my blog back almost, man, a decade ago at this point, I started seeing references to, at least in the French case, to we're fighting like we fought in the War of Polish Succession. When they're describing the War of Austrian Succession, when they're describing the Seven Years' War, they're not saying, oh, there's something radically new that's going on here. They're saying, this reminds us of what the fighting was like in the War of Polish Succession. And so, for maybe an example that would be familiar to our audience, the sort of the great sacrifice of the Black Watch at Ticonderoga in 1758, as they're sort of launching assaults on Montcalm's fortified positions. When that day is over, and Montcalm's writing his after-action report or his battle report, he doesn't say, wow, our soldiers were taking cover behind trees and firing at the British as they came in, and they were taking cover behind stumps and firing back at us. This is something unique in North America. He says, oh, this reminds me very much of the quality of the firefight at the Battle of Parma in 1734. And so references like that made me think, wow, even though it's not maybe directly relevant to us in the States or in the UK, maybe I need to go back to that war, the War of Polish Succession, to kind of try and find where some of this stuff comes from.
And I mean, this might go off piste slightly, but are there accounts from the War of Polish Succession that then refer back to previous conflicts in themselves? Do you find that by doing that, sort of rightly so, I think, backwards looking, start at the beginning and try and get where you're going, or is that a real turning point in terms of infantry combat?
So it's the first large-scale war in about 20 years since the end of the War of Spanish Succession. And so as a result, when the authors in this war writing about battle, what they're not doing so much is saying, oh, this reminds us of the War of Spanish Succession. They're noting a break. When you read Italian battle reports and French battle reports, they don't say, wow, this was just like the fighting in the Spanish Succession. What they say is, the infantry aren't coming to fight with the bayonet. We're just engaged in a firefight. You're sort of charging with bayonets in order to push the enemy off the battlefield. That seems new. That seems different. They're also referencing the importance of infantry warfare. They note the terrain in northern Italy. And one French officer, I think, writing home to his mother, actually says the cavalry had no role. It was no country for them. So trying to sort of see maybe the ways the terrain in northern Italy combined with the fact that these armies are relatively green. There's not been a large scale war in 20 years. That I think maybe does give some evidence for this is maybe a break, this is the start of a period rather than just the continuation of the War of Spanish Succession. Now, kind of getting ahead of ourselves here, one of the things that I really look at in the book is the use of cover, and sort of alternatingly taking cover and returning fire by soldiers on the battlefield. This is something that's probably been going on as long as men have been using firearms, right? I reference in the introduction during the Battle of Nördlingen in the 30 Years' War, the Spanish will throw themselves to the ground and then stand back up in order to fire at their enemies. So I wouldn't be maybe too stringent in saying that, man, this is a radical break that we've never seen before. But I do think there's enough going on here to say, if we're going to write about the story of mid 18th century warfare, let's start it in the 1730s and kind of take it up through the end of the American War of Independence.
Apologies. We will get to battle in just a moment, but I'm just curious about what you're saying there in relation to periodization. Is there an argument to be made that we've got it wrong, therefore, when we talk about long 18th centuries, long 19th centuries? It's one of the sort of favorite chew the fat topics for historians, right? But it strikes me that this is a very different way of thinking about it and bringing a different perspective. So I just wanted to sort of dig into that a little bit.
Yeah. So I was on the phone with Andrew Bamford about a year and a half ago, and he described kind of he was the acquiring editor for the book initially, before he sort of ended his work with Hellion. And so he described this period as the high 18th century. And I think long and short, you may goodness knows you could take the 18th century all the way back to like 1648 and take it all the way forward to 1815. I do think that it's not a bad, at least in terms of political and military history, not a bad periodization, that really, I mean, if you want to call it a short definition of the 18th century, I do think that there's a little bit different in terms of the qualitative nature of the fighting. Then we move into the wars of the French Revolution, we move into the wars of the Napoleonic period. I do think it's a little different from the sort of maybe the larger wars of the 9 Years' War and the Spanish Succession in the later part of the 17th century and the very early part of the 18th century. So yeah, whether you want to call it a short 18th century, or whether you want to kind of break this up and say here we are in the high 18th century, I do think there's something worthwhile and rewarding perhaps in looking at this. I mean, you could call it like the twilight of the ancien regime, or whatever however you want to take it, right? This 50-year period from the 1730s up until the War of Independence or the French Revolution. I do think there's something specific happening, at least an infantry battle in this time.
It's almost as though centuries aren't necessarily the most helpful demarcation.
Absolutely. Yeah, there we fully agree.
Okay, let's get to battle then, and we'll start with the fundamentals. This is an odd way of doing it, but I'm conscious that we're the Nap Wars pod, so we kind of have to start with an end point and then work backwards for people. Most listeners will probably have watched Sharp. They might have watched the Napoleon movie if they had like hours of their life to waste. They might have watched Waterloo. Now, none of those films or medias necessarily give you a brilliant indication of the realities of warfare during this period, but they do give people a perception. So I'm curious about how much there is in that popular perception that people would recognize in the period that you're looking at, but equally how much of the groundwork for what we do see during the French Rev and Napoleonic Wars is laid over the course of the 18th century.
So I would say, especially for an American audience, I mean, the one that we're probably most familiar with is The Patriot, right? So the Mel Gibson flick from I think it is 2000. I was going to say the early 2000s, but I think it is the year 2000, or thereabouts. And so thinking about battle there, I mean, that movie essentially tells a story of British troops in bright red uniforms getting picked off from long range by Americans with long rifles. And of course, listeners of the pod and anyone who's ever heard of Robbie McNiven will know that's absolute bunk. But with that said, particularly the sequence depicted that's supposed to be the Battle of Camden, where the British are advancing against the Continentals and both sides are sort of formed in line. This is archetypical depiction of 18th century warfare. Both sides have their banners kind of sort of flying in the breeze. Both sides are trading volleys. One side will fire, and then the other side will fire, and then the other, first side will reload it, and sort of going back and forth. And then, of course, it all ends as most Patriot and Outlander and Sharp battles do in kind of a melee where they're sort of mixing it up with hatchets or whatever in hand-to-hand combat. And it's a very so many levels. It's a relatively bad depiction of 18th century warfare, and tragically, and this is going to sound like a knock on reenactors, and it's not. I'm a reenactor. I know Liam as well is a reenactor. When you go to reenactments and you see the sides lined up firing at each other, frequently they're doing it at like 25 or 50 yards. That's really close range for the 18th century. So if you're picturing one of these fights in the 18th century, or even in the French Revolution or Napoleonic period, I think it's important to kind of extend the ranges in your mind. Put a football pitch or an American football field in between the opposing forces at least, about 100 yards. That's a pretty good average firefight distance. So sometimes they'll get closer, particularly if they're on their way in to charge with bayonets, but they'll also fire at longer distances. I mean, you have descriptions of troops firing from 200, 250 yards, 300 yards with these weapons. Now, are they picking off a man-sized target with a smoothbore weapon at that range? Probably not. But when you have a whole battalion firing, you're doing attritional damage at 300 yards, at 250 yards, at 200 yards. And so some officers and sort of some, certainly enlisted men would think, man, maybe 200 yards, that's close enough to the enemy. Let's try some pot shots here and sort of see what happens. So make the ranges longer. I would say is the first sort of thing I would say if you want a more accurate mental image of these battles. Secondly, the troops are not always waiting for command to fire. They're firing independently. Frequently, they will fire without waiting for the officer's orders. This is something that drives officers up the wall. George, if you ever have, 4 hours, go through Founders Online, which is paid for by our National Archives, and read George Washington's orders of the day. And it's just a list of the men are firing at too long a range. A penalty of death he advocates by 1779 for men who fire without orders from too great a range. They don't. He says again, they're throwing away their fire. They're throwing away their fire. And so this is something that common soldiers are doing. They're taking the role of fighting the battle kind of out of their officers' hands into their own hands. But when you imagine 18th century firefights, when you imagine 18th century battle, think about the men firing at will, most likely. I mean, there's some exceptions to this. I would say we shouldn't take it too far, but by and large, they're probably firing at will. They're probably sort of, in the time, it was called a running fire in English or a Plackerfeuer in German. This is a much more common method of engaging the enemy. It's not very effective. And I have been sort of had on a very long back and forth on Facebook with one of your listeners, Johann Karl Weiss, about the exact nature of whether or not this was is it possible for all the ranks to fire in kind of this irregular running manner? Probably not. Maybe just the first two. So the officers have reasons for why they would like the battle to look like the Patriot. I think if you asked an 18th century officer or transported him to 2025 and sat him down and showed him Sharp or showed him, Napoleon or maybe not Napoleon, but showed him the Patriot, he would say, "Man, this is great. This is exactly how we want the battles to go." But I mean, this is why it's so important to what we opened up with, kind of doing history from below, not just reading the prescriptive literature from officers saying, this is what we'd like battle to look like in an ideal world. You also want to read descriptive literature from enlisted men saying, yeah, this is what actually happened in the battlefield. And frequently those are worlds apart. And so to some extent, that's what I'm trying to do in this book. I'm trying to bridge the gulf from what the officers would like to have happen on the one hand to what the enlisted men actually do on the other hand.
Alex, I've got a couple of quick follow-ups, and I think it'd be really good if you could give us, at least in your opinion, what is the best media depiction of 18th century warfare? A couple that spring to mind for me are Barry Lyndon, Last of the Mohicans. There's some bits in, obviously, Outlander you mentioned. Yeah, so what in your opinion do you think is the most, I guess, the most accurate depiction of 18th century infantry firefights?
Yeah, so I would say for my part, it's got to be Barry Lyndon. I don't love everything about the initial battle where he's in the British Army still, and is sort of advancing on the French. It's not a bad depiction. It's I mean, compared to what we get these days with things like like the Napoleon movie or even the Patriot. I think it's a world ahead of that. But particularly when he's in the Prussian army, when they are the French, and it doesn't make a lot of sense historically it to be the French, but the French are attacking a village, and the Prussian troops are in the village, in the buildings, firing out of windows at the French who are on the outside of the village. To me, that's a very accurate depiction of 18th century warfare. And there, you see, they actually have a sort of probably a 6 pounder. I'd have to watch the clip again to be sure, but like a 6 pounder in the street to kind of clear some of the space between the buildings. Reading accounts of like the Battle of Quebec in 1775, that's exactly how the Royal Artillerymen are using these pieces. They're using them to sweep the streets in urban battle, while the infantrymen are sort of firing from windows and houses. So I again. What I wouldn't give for Stanley Kubrick to still be alive and making 18th century film, wouldn't that be a wonderful world? So I would say that's great. As far as more modern stuff, I mean, that's showing its age. The 50th anniversary is this December of Barry Lyndon. Last of the Mohicans isn't horrible. I don't love everything about it. They're the soldiers are very robotic in that they're waiting for their officers' words of command as they're being slaughtered by Native Americans. That doesn't speak to me much of sort of the real life impact of watching your friends say be tomahawked in front of you, your reaction to it. With that said, I do think that the sequences of the siege of Fort William Henry are fairly good, not necessarily in terms of how they're described. It's not just get the mortars in range and then immediately you win the siege like there's nobody's business. That's not really how 18th century sieges worked. But the depictions of the firing back and forth and the importance of advancing the sap, that's a great depiction of 18th century siege warfare. And then there's a sally by about maybe a company of British infantry. That's not a horrible depiction of British infantry in battle in the 18th century either. So I would say, listeners, if you have not checked that stuff out, go. You can find it all on YouTube these days. Just go look for these battle scenes, and you'll maybe have a slightly better image of 18th century warfare than maybe more recent stuff, unfortunately.
Awesome. Well, that's a great direction to put our listeners down to get some more info about this. What I want to talk about now is that motivation of 18th century soldiers, okay? Because one of the things that you mentioned earlier that sort of perked my ears is, Washington's issuing these general orders to grip these guys not to fire really on pain of death, but clearly they're still doing it, right? I mean, there's a huge question in there of why are they still doing it? And they would know their weapon systems. They would know their lethality, their capability, and they would know that it's probably not as effective in single shots and at increased ranges. So, how important was that discipline and I guess fear of punishment in this era of rigid linear warfare, and why would guys go against it?
Yeah, these are great questions. So let's kind of break them down one at a time. First of all, let's talk about motivation. I would say despite I think my book does a pretty good job of this. The sort of read that you have to check out if you've not yet is Ilya Berkovich's Motivation in War, which looks at 18th century fighting men and kind of what really makes them tick. I specifically am a historian of the British Army and the Prussian Army and the American Army or the Continental Army in the 18th century, and so I've spent a good deal of time with these armies. But Ilya takes us further with the sort of the French and the Austrians, and it's a magisterial tome, and if you've not yet bought it or read it, you really should. But in my world, in Britain, in Prussia, in the United States, even, but maybe we'll talk about the United States a little later. These troops are very interested in their sort of local worlds. The sort of social life in the village is quite important to them. And particularly in the Prussian army, the state does a really good job of picking up on these local and family connections. And so they recruit their men in what's called the canton system. Eventually, the British Army will adopt stuff like this after the Childers reforms, I think, in the 1880s. But in even in our period, the 1782 Army Reform Act is designed to try to sort of start this process in motion, even if it's not entirely successful. These local bonds, this local identity really does give cohesive glue, sort of local unit cohesion to the Prussian army in the 18th century. You don't really want to run off in the middle of battle. If you've got men you've known your whole life from your village there in your platoon, you don't want to leave Uncle Johann there facing the Russians down by himself. You know, this is even on a more basic level. I mean, if it's not a family relation, you don't want to run off in front of men from your village because they'll write home to the village and say, yeah, this guy kind of ditched us on the battlefield, right? So there's both, I think, maybe a positive inner leadership and also kind of a fear of shame element to this. So these local connections, these family connections, are quite important. In my dissertation, and a little bit in this, I looked at the letters of two Prussian soldiers, an uncle and a nephew, who are there in the same platoon in the same regiment, and kind of the importance of this family bond and kind of sustaining them in their military service. So local connections, family connections, very important. You also see the beginnings, I think, of state patriotism in the 18th century world. Christopher Duffy would say it's most pronounced in places like Britain and Prussia. Excuse me, Britain and Russia, not Prussia, but Russia over in sort of the far part of Eastern Europe. He says he claims, I don't know if I fully agree with this, you see the beginnings of nationalism in Russia and Great Britain by, say, the Seven Years' War. But certainly, I do think ordinary soldiers that I'm familiar with and have studied in places like Prussia, they care a lot about the king. They care about monarchical ideologies. They care about religious ideologies. And the state kind of uses these things and kind of ties them together in what Sasha and Catherine Mubius have called the God and King ideology in the Seven Years' War. So these men believe essentially that they've got to be loyal to the monarchy, and that the king is a pretty talented guy in some ways, Frederick the Great. He's not going to lead us astray. We've got to kind of be faithful to him, and then we also, we have a religious duty and obligation to support the state, to support the monarchy, and so these things kind of tie together. And again, if you're um, interested in reading more on this, Sasha and Katrine's book is Prussian Army Soldiers in the Seven Years' War, The Psychology of Honor. It's a great examination of kind of the mental world of these Prussian soldiers in the 18th century. But even in armies that aren't quite necessarily as monarchical or even as religious, like the British Army in the 18th century, there are a lot of young men who sign up not because they're drunkards or they're trying to escape a pregnant girlfriend or something like this to go out into the army, or they want 3 square meals a day or something like this. You have a lot of men like Roger Lamb, who said from a young age, I was very interested. I wanted to go into the army. I wanted to be a soldier. And so very early on, I sort of set upon a military career. You have other, men in the 18th century, a young man whose name I can't recall right now. He fights at the Battle of Camden. He sort of, from a young age, he wants a military career, and it's like 15 years old. He goes up to the recruiting sergeant, and the recruiting sergeant says, "Man, you're a little young. Why don't you come back in a couple of years? I'll pay for a new suit of clothes. I'll pay for a cocked hat for you. But why don't you grow up a little bit, get some more meat on those bones, and come back and sort of join the regiment when you're ready to do so." So I'm not sure. I wouldn't say necessarily this is nationalism. Maybe it's patriotism, but I do think there's almost like, for young men, there's an attraction to military life. There's a sense that military life is maybe dangerous and exciting. Go off and see the world and sort of be part of something bigger than yourself. This is there in the 18th century. It's not just something that's produced by the nationalism of the French Revolution, and we see in the more modern, 19th and 20th centuries. I do think, especially in Britain, especially in northern Germany, maybe you talk about the United States if we have time. You see young men who are saying, "Man, I have family loyalty. I have state loyalty. Maybe I sort of like the idea of being in the military, what that would mean for me, and so they enlist as a result.
I'm going to press you on the discipline side of things.
Great. Yeah, good.
Granted, folks who um, subscribe to Patreon or buy the exclusive episodes will have heard a much longer exploration of this, but it is a key facet rather of this. So can we just sort of dip briefly into that kind of that discipline element? It's not all about fear. It's
Sure.
this is going to tie into something else that we're going to talk about in a minute, but that there's discipline looks like a regimented set thing and actually is, as you're saying with regards to things like firing, there is a yawning chasm between the stipulation and the reality. And I just want to kind of delve into that because again this ties into this whole history from below kind of theme.
Certainly. Yeah, yeah. I'm sorry. I think I forgot to answer that half of the question. But the in the 18th century armies, you usually hear comments from Frederick the Great like soldiers should fear their officers more than the enemy, and this is really what binds armies together. And I think it's interesting. He makes that comment in 1763 after he's had a really rough time in the Seven Years' War. If you read his earlier writings, he says things like, "Man, we want men from the same village because these citizen soldiers, so dat citoyen." He literally uses the language that we would associate with the French Revolution to describe his men back in the 1740s and 50s. Discipline is, you usually think about it as a Prussian soldier with an officer with a cane who's kind of there, sort of wrapping the knuckles of the heads and shoulders of the guys who are running away. Or in the case of Washington, right? I mean, we think of, especially as Americans, we think of Washington as this great heroic figure. He says in his order the day after the Battle of Brandywine, which those of you in UK might recall is a fairly big loss for us, win for you guys in 1777. He says soldiers who run away without orders on pain of death, the officers should strike them down. Indeed, we have descriptions from the Battle of Guilford Courthouse that marksmen are placed behind the American line with orders to shoot down men who run away prematurely. So there is, I would say, we shouldn't take the scholarly revolution so far that we say coercive discipline has no role on these battlefields. But with that said, there are not a ton of officers in the 18th century armies. Certainly, if you look at the like a company of men or a platoon of men in the Prussian army, it's 75 men, three or four officers. If the officers are not injured, if they're at full strength, you can't possibly spear all of these men if they're trying to run away with your spontoon. And so as a result, Katrine and Sasha Mubius have made the argument. I think it's a fairly good one. Coercion is a factor. It's probably there. These men are not just thinking, I don't want to look bad in front of my village, compatriots. I also don't want to run away in front of the officer. But realistically, these threats of death, and we talked about this in the Patreon episode last time, and I brought up an example of in Orders of the Day from His Royal Highness the Duke of Cumberland in the 18th century, where the soldiers are in a camp are increasingly like fishing from a nobleman's ponds, and he says, "Stop doing this! We're gonna hang any soldier we find who is fishing from these noblemen's ponds." Well, he issues that order like 3 or 4 times, and so the threat of death for us today seems like, wow, that's an extreme threat. If these George Washington must be a pretty mean guy if he's saying, kill soldiers who are running away. Very rarely are these things actually followed through on. And there in my next book, actually looking at the Continental Army, I do have one example in the 18th century of a soldier being executed in the face of the enemy for not following orders. It actually comes from the American Army. It comes from the Continental Army in the attack on Stony Point in 1779. And here, a soldier is ordered to attack with bayonets. It's a night attack. You don't want to have loaded weapons because you don't want the men popping off at a long range and alerting the British garrison that you're there. And this soldier says, I don't understand the idea of attacking with my weapon unloaded. This seems like an idiotic thing. And so he starts charging his piece. And the officer, stabs him through the heart and executes him. So it's not to say it never happens. It does happen, but if I've spent my life studying 18th century armies, and that's the one example I can find in the literature of a soldier being executed in front of the enemy for sort of misconduct, it's a pretty rare occurrence. And it is worth saying he's not doing it because that soldier's running away. He's doing it because that soldier is taking an action that's threatening to the lives of the other men. If the British are alerted and start opening fire with the artillery pieces there at Stony Point, a lot of Americans are going to die. And so this officer kind of makes the calculation: I could try and kill this guy who's going to alert the British to our presence, or I could let us our presence be known and suffer the losses that will result. So again, it's very easy to think if you just read these orders of the day at face value, it's very easy to think, wow, it's a draconian army, and the soldiers are getting killed right and left by their officers for any minor infractions. Very rarely are there any consequences for running away in front of the enemy. This is something that is not. These orders are usually not followed through on. They're more of a threat, and the men probably know to some extent they're more of a threat rather than hundreds of men are going to go in front of firing squads running away from the enemy at the end of the battle or something like this.
Yeah, the Mutiny Act is a perfect example of the acclimatization that these guys would have had to the threat of death. You go through the Mutiny Act, and almost every other thing says so and so, anybody caught for doing X or Y or Z shall suffer death or such other punishment as by a general court martial shall be awarded. There's an important caveat going on there.
Yeah.
And this ties in very nicely with where I want to go next, which is negotiated authority, which again kind of has this kind of loop back to what we're discussing here in terms of this. There's a threatening somebody with violence can get you so far in getting them to be compliant, right? And that if you've got a unit of cavalry bearing down on a line battalion that's strung out in line or whatever, like at that moment in time, the immediate threat of the people about to run over them with the pointy sabers absolutely outweighs the okay, this guy behind me might or might not turn around and stab me or put me in front of a court martial. There is this boundary, and I think you kind of outlined this really nicely. So what is your kind of negotiated authority? I don't mean within a sort of educational lecturing seminar style context. I mean this in the sense that I've talked about negotiated authority within a couple of contexts, particularly discipline and crime and punishment. Within an 18th century battlefield, though, where do you see what you regard as negotiated authority?
Yeah, I love the idea of it. My negotiated authority is like my dean. What can I get away with without being executed by my vice president of academic affairs, something like this. Thank goodness I don't live in this kind of world. But no, so negotiated authority is a at this point kind of venerable concept in the early modern field, and even in 18th century military history. Folks like Stephen Brumwell and Will Tatum have examined it, usually in relationship to the military justice system, usually in relationship to sort of what can the men get away with in what do they actually get punished for, questions like this. But I'm really looking at it kind of on the battlefield, right? In a tactical setting, what is negotiated authority, and how do officers and men try to negotiate this relationship between them? So let's look at a practical example in a modern war, right? Say you are in Vietnam in the 1960s, and your platoon is pinned down by a North Vietnamese heavy machine gun or something like this. The officer in charge of your platoon can say all day long, I want you to go and charge and close with that machine gun. But to some extent, the men have agency on whether or not they're actually going to go do that, right? It is relatively easy for the men in the heat of battle to say, sir, I don't know that that's a great idea. Let's not necessarily go and cross into the open and get mowed down by this machine gun. In a more classic kind of military example, I don't know if it's this way in the UK, but very much in the US Army, there's a sense that junior officers who are fresh out of, I guess your version would be like Sandhurst or something like this, but our West Point, it's really the senior NCOs who are in charge of these formations for a little while. Before the officers actually say, okay, Master Sergeant, I'll actually take authority now. I appreciate all the advice you've given me, but I think I know what's going on now. So that's an example of negotiated authority, right? But in an 18th century sense, sort of going back to the examples in combat, at the Battle of Kay in 1759, there's a Prussian officer, Johann Jakob Lemke, who's trying to get his men to close with a Russian artillery battery. They're all in cover behind trees. Yes, indeed. Even Prussians hid behind trees in the 18th century. Hiding behind trees, not necessarily North American phenomenon. And so these artillery fires opening up on us here, or opening up on these Prussians, and he's saying, man, we've got to close with that enemy battery. We're going to get in there with our bayonets, kind of mix it up with these artillerymen. It could be a scene from Outlander, right? And so the men say, we're good. We'd rather stay behind these trees. We don't really want to go with and attack that battery of artillery. It's going to be firing, canister anti-personnel munitions at us. This seems like kind of a suicidal order. And so not really taking this relationship of negotiated authority that I describe in the book, and I'll describe more fully here in a minute, in its best sense, Lemke whips out his sword and starts hitting the men with the flat of his sword, like, you scum, go do this. And he then gets his ankle broken when a round shot sort of skips through, and the men immediately run away and leave him there in the battle. He's in Russian captivity for a time. So this is an example of negotiated authority gone wrong from the perspective of both the officers and the men, right? You're using your authority in kind of this draconian, kind of horrible way. You're hitting your men, you're physically punishing them, trying to get them to go do something, and the men basically, leave you in the lurch, and you get captured by the Russians. Never a fun place to be. So at this point, reading stuff like this, I thought, well, this is a pretty negative example of the relationship between officers and men in the 18th century. What is a more positive example of this world of negotiated authority? And in some ways, it's almost like, and I use this language in the book, the officers are married to their men in the 18th century. You have like a relationship that it's kind of has obligations on both sides. And particularly, you have a French officer named the Chevalier de Rais describes what the aspirational, like, what in an ideal world, what does this relationship between officers and men looks like? And he says, it is in the nature of soldiers never to abandon officers that they esteem and love. Sorry, Hauptmann Lemke, your soldiers doesn't look like they esteem and love you very much if they've sort of run off and left you to be captured by the Russians. Ray continues, we must do the same for them. Visit them in their tents. Move to where the advance guards are fighting, and only part company with them when you die beside them. With these sentiments, officers will train their soldiers well and become distinguished in the actions of war. So live with your men, fight with your men, die with your men. This is kind of the reciprocal relationship that soldiers and officers are, in the best military tradition, are expecting in the 18th century. And so, again and again, and I sort of bring up examples ad nauseum in the book, but you have, when officers lead from the front, when the officers are not hitting the men with the flats of their swords, but instead saying, like Colonel Webster at Guilford Courthouse, come on, my brave Fusiliers, let's go, face the American second line together. The soldiers respond very well to this kind of positive inner leadership, right? The soldiers respond very well to moments like in the American War of Independence, where Hauptmann von Eckert of the Ansbach Bayreuth contingent, he's been shot in the arm. he's well within his rights to go and seek medical attention behind the lines. But he's leading grenadiers in an assault an American position and says, "No, I'm not going to abandon my men. I'm not going to go and seek medical attention. We're going to continue this assault. I'm going to continue to lead from the front." And he ends up paying with his life. But these are the kind of almost, I mean, maybe it's taking a little far to say heroic. I mean, I do think it is rather heroic, but these kind of actions really motivate the enlisted men to face grave danger, to face sort of deadly violence, in a way that saying, go take that battery of cannons and then hitting the men with the flat of your sword when they don't doesn't necessarily inspire them in the same way. And so, kind of here we can see the breakdown of that discipline that we were just talking about, right? I mean, the threat of the officer's there. He's hitting you with his sword. Maybe he's going to kill you. He's probably not really going to kill you. That doesn't inspire you to go fight. Whereas the officer saying, "Man, I've been badly wounded, but I'm not going to leave you guys in the lurch," that inspires the men to go and then assault the American position, eventually win the battle. So again, this negotiated authority, you can try and manage this relationship in different ways, both as an enlisted man and as an officer. I think when you're trying to do this in maybe a more positive way, the enlisted men react better to it.
Alex, I think that's a brilliant story of not so glorious Prussian feat of arms there. And I kind of want to sort of dig into that a little bit. I mean, my first kind of exposure to Prussians is a lot, I guess, a bit later. But, you're talking about David Dundas, and he writes his principles of military maneuvers after seeing the Prussians, I think in 1784. And that then obviously goes forward and kind of sets up the British Army drill manuals for the next 20 years, 30 years, if not more. So I guess the question with that is, was the Prussian army and Frederick the Great's system for drill and for training infantry unique? And how did it influence other armies? And I guess the period as a whole as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I realize I've just shared a very negative example. I mean, if you read that chapter of the book, there are lots of examples of Prussian officers leading in sort of very inspiring ways. I don't think their army or their officer corps is marked by this kind of almost like lead from behind, hit the men with the flats of their swords, try to get them to go forward. You have figures like Marshal Schwerin, who's, a field marshal. He's a very high-ranking officer. When the attack starts going south at Prague, he grabs the colors of one of the regiments and leads them forward himself, and actually gets hit by a blast of canister and pays with his life as a result. So, I mean, I do think there are Prussian officers who are kind of leading in this more active and successful military tradition, and maybe that's why the Prussian army is fairly effective in some ways in the 18th century. But with that said, there is this sense out there that the Prussian army is maybe marked by a more robotic discipline than other armies. I mean, we were having a healthy debate on the one of the American War of Independence reenacting Facebook groups over the weekend of whether or not British officers even kind of carry canes into action. Because in the Prussian army, a cane is basically like a part of the uniform, right? You'd be able to whack the men on the heads if they're acting poorly. I can't find any period images of troops in combat where British officers have canes, right? So maybe you can see slight differences here. With that said, Prussian soldiers are drilled very effectively. They take part in very realistic war games, which is something Frederick the Great doesn't really invent, I would say, but something he popularizes in a mass way in the 18th century. So especially opposed war games where you have your side and the op for using the American terminology. I don't know what you all call the enemy in the UK. Maybe it's the same term. But this is sort of important in training the men. It's important in training the officers. You're sort of seeing realistically, or at least semi-realistically, what is maneuvering in front of the enemy look like? What range are we going to open fire at? And so this type of training does make the Prussians very effective. The Prussians are highly effective at performing pre-battle maneuvers. The Prussians are trained at nauseum how to load and fire quickly. That does matter in the 18th century context. It's not just about especially in a Euro-American, excuse me, a sort of British and American tradition. I think we prize accuracy of fire, right? We prize soldiers who can hit the target on the first shot and hit it again and again. Um, that's very important, but also volume of fire is incredibly important in firefights. I mean, even today, you want a base of fire and a machine gun to kind of keep the enemy pinned down as your element is maneuvering, right? That's true in the 18th century world as well. Trying to overawe the enemy with a high volume of fire is one of the ways you win battles in an 18th century world, and the Prussians do this very effectively. And so, seeing their performance in the War of Austrian Succession, seeing their I will say, very unlikely survival in the 7 Years' War when it looks like the Prussian monarchy is about to collapse. They managed to survive this fight. Um, all across Europe, officers from the British Army and the French Army, the Russian Army, and the Saxons, the Swedes, they all come into Prussia and observe these war games in the sort of spring and fall as the Prussian army is kind of going through its maneuvers. I mean, even in our case, in the Continental Army, after the war comes to an end in 1783, we start sending officers over to go and observe the Prussian maneuvers. So this is it's a this style of Prussian discipline, this style of Prussian realistic training, the way the Prussians sort of handle tactics does absolutely go out and influence these other 18th century armies. And it's what Christopher Duffy is called, and I call in my book Prussomania, the desire to make everything exactly like it is in Prussia. This is really not very effective. In many ways, I think it's sort of like you're copying the externals and not really copying what makes the army tick. I mean, I think a famous example, at least in modern American military circles, is the Afghan army that we were training during the Global War on Terror. They wanted to wear woodland camouflage uniforms because they wanted to look like how they picture soldiers looking for like the 80s and 90s. Well, fighting in the mountains of Afghanistan, woodland camo is not always going to be your best go-to. And so just copying the externals of what the paradigm army looks like is not always going to provide you the best results. And so adopting a Prussian style coat, adopting a Prussian style hat, this is probably not going to make your army fight like the Prussians. Bringing over ex-Prussian officers like the mascot of my university, Baron von Steuben, or a Freiherr de Steuben, as he probably would have preferred, that actually does have some pretty good effects. And I won't say the American Army is a tactically perfect organization in the American War of Independence. I don't think it is. But after Steuben comes over and really starts instituting a system of quality control in our training, our combat effectiveness does go up a good bit. So I do think, I often look in the book as sort of Prussiomania as the officers taking their desire to control the engagements and maybe taking it too far and using the Prussians as a justification for that. But in some ways, the Prussians are a fairly good army in the 18th century, and trying to learn from them if you're doing that in effective ways maybe isn't a horrible idea.
Can I stay with something that you've teed up really nicely for us there in relation to the experience of war in North America? We have puzzled over this in the past, right? The extent to which what we see in North America is either unique or a continuity. We literally did an episode that in part kind of dwelt on this. The exceptionalism or otherwise of the American Continental Army, the way in which the British army fails or succeeds, but ultimately doesn't manage to get it right, and the extent to which that is perhaps in part dictated by a failure to adapt properly. There's a lot tied up in there, and with your end point kind of coming with the American War of Independence, what do you see kind of happening there? Give us your sort of, if you like, 5 minutes on the North American situation, which I guess we should say isn't just about the conflict for American independence. There is also the French Indian Wars to consider, and to what extent is there a follow through from the French Indian Wars into what then plays out during the War of Independence? Many questions
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, many questions. So I'll try and pack through them maybe in reverse order. And if I get one, remind me. But starting with the French and Indian War. because I, in my mind, from a tactical perspective, maybe even from an operational perspective, but certainly on the battlefield, the French and Indian War and the War of Independence are two different animals. To a large extent, the French and Indian War is more of a wilderness war. It's the army kind of going through the difficult terrain, getting to a remote French or British outpost and placing it under siege. And so the French and Indian War, by and I mean, obviously, Plains of Abraham is a significant exception to this, but by and large, French and Indian War is a war of sieges in the wilderness. This is really what's going on. I mean, the British Army trying to get all the way out to Niagara, right? The British Army trying to sort of get all the way to Pittsburgh. These are hard to get to places. You're sort of cutting trail through the wilderness on your way out in order to approach these remote French fortresses, and you're then besieging them and maybe fighting a small battle with a relief army in the course of that siege. That's really what the for me, for my part, the French and Indian War looks like. The American War of Independence, by contrast, it looks much more like a archetypical European war. It's a war where sieges do happen. I mean, the Siege of Charleston, for example, a very important moment in the War of Independence. But by and large, there are a lot of field battles. There are a lot of field battles that are fairly close to built-up urban concentrations, like Philadelphia or New York City, or Albany or Boston. These field battles look a little bit more like what's going on over in Europe than the French and Indian War did. And a French officer, Duportail, comes over, he's an engineering officer, and says, yeah, we've got kind of our perception of the war in America all wrong. I don't see any terrain in America. Now, of course, he's only been in the relatively developed parts of Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. I don't see anything in America that looks different from Hesse or Westphalia or the sort of the western regions of Germany. And so, from the perspective of troops fighting a lot of this war, not necessarily people like George Rogers Clark, who were going out into Ohio and Indiana and fighting a wilderness war in the War of Independence, but for George Washington, for Cornwallis, for Howe, they are really fighting a war that looks a little bit more like the Seven Years' War than the French and Indian War did. It looks a little bit more like the European Seven Years' War than the French and Indian War did. Now, with that said, there are tactical legacies in the War of Independence, particularly from the British Army. The British Army tries to open up their files. They fight in open order. They fight with trail. They're carrying their weapons down at the trail, not up at the shoulder. Of course, this is they reduce the number of ranks from 3 down to 2. So you're fighting with in 2 ranks in open order. This is stuff that they had done a bit in the French and Indian War, and they kind of go back and are doing it again here in the American War of Independence. And when a guy who's seeing this for the first time, the Baron or Freiherr von Riedesel, who's a German, essentially a Hessian, who's coming over and fighting for the British, he's seeing this for the first time. He says, why are the British doing this? Because this is how they learned to fight the French and Indian War. They learned the lessons of that war, and that war taught them you've got to open up your ranks and files. You got to cover yourself by means of trees. After that, you'll be successful. And so, again, Revolutionary War is Mel Gibson hid behind trees and the British war powder rigs out in the open. It's probably not a very good picture. There are a lot of resources that you could update that. I would say the British Army is one of the more dangerous armies in the 18th century world. It's probably not the best army in the world, which is what often we tell ourselves as Americans, because, it's the best army in the world and we beat you, so good on us. It makes us feel quite nice. It does, the British Army, display a great deal of adaptability, flexibility, quick movement, aggressive thinking. This enables the British to win battle after battle in the War of Independence. And so I would say if there's something that makes the British Army unique, it's kind of the opposite of how many Americans picture it. The British Army is a flexible force. It's an adaptable force. It's a force that's willing to look at how it fights with kind of a long, penetrating gaze and say, how can we be more effective? This is something that I think as the 250th anniversaries we're on, the British are getting more credit for here in the States. Now, the American army, by contrast, is an army that evolves in the course of the War of Independence. It starts out with kind of that ideal that Americans like to tell themselves, which is, so a whole bunch of angry Americans show up with guns to fight against you all at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. This is not really an army. It's essentially militias that are kind of being upgraded into a much more serious military force. But as the War of Independence goes on, the American army starts to look more like a standard 18th century fighting force. It starts to look more like the Prussian army or even the British army or the French army. It starts to adopt sort of more rigid systems of discipline. The idea of the virtuous American citizen soldier leaving his home with his musket to go and fight. Well, that's probably true in 1775 and 1776. But as that war wears on, even the social composition. I mean, American soldiers, some of them are there because they really care about the cause, absolutely. But there are also men who have bills to pay, and who are joining the army because they think it is, a way to get a sign-on bonus. It's a way to get out of problems in their civilian life. And so these stereotypes exist in European armies, and I think we've qualified them a good bit. I would say in this way, the American army does probably look a lot, especially after 1776, a lot like a European army, in that you have men who are there motivated by patriotic concerns. You also have men who are trying to fulfill the material needs of life. These two groups are kind of married together in an American context. In terms of tactics, the American army is a little bit more conventional than the British. The British are flexible, they're adaptable, they're fast moving, and they're probably moving at a jog in a lot of these engagements in the American War of Independence. Washington would like to have an army that is proficient and aggressive enough to fight like this. As the war is coming to an end, his orders of the day go from threatening the men with death to when they run away to saying, man, wouldn't it be great if we fought war with bayonets like the British? Wouldn't it be great if we charged and tried to intimidate the enemy? This would really be his preferred way of fighting. But really, especially, I would say, in the middle and later years of the War of Independence, the American army is more of a bog standard army of continental Europe in terms of its tactical doctrine. You engage the enemy with firepower as they're coming in. Maybe, if the men are well drilled, you fire with platoons if you can pull that off. There is some indication that a few American officers are able to fire with platoons. Say the Battle of Connecticut Farms or Springfield in 1780. It's not a force that is maybe as aggressive, as fast moving, as flexible, as adaptable as the British Army, but it's a force that realizes, man, if we use firepower to attrit the British as they're coming in, logistically, they have to bring over reinforcements all the way from the UK or other imperial dominions. That's going to take time. That's going to cost a lot of money. Eventually, the British are going to leave us and kind of go home. And so this method of war, it's not fun or sexy in that it wins a whole bunch of decisive battles. I mean, a lot of American listeners will be familiar with Saratoga and Cowpens because they're the ones where we win big. Tragically, that's not the average experience of battle for Americans. I mean, I won't say tragically because I don't hate the British Army necessarily, but it's not the average experience of battle for the Americans in the War of Independence. You all are seeing our backs much more frequently than we're seeing yours in the course of the fighting. Outside of the world of battle, I think especially in the South, there is a guerrilla war that the British Army, and more particularly loyalists, does struggle to win. But really, on the battlefield, on average, the British Army is winning more battles than it's losing. And so this perhaps is why you see venerable comparisons going all the way back to the 70s from American historians comparing our American experience, the United States experience in the Vietnam War, to what the British experienced in the American War of Independence. That the Americans frequently say, we won all the battles in the Vietnam War, but it didn't matter any. And to some extent, that's, I think, also true of the British Army in the Revolution. Tactically, again and again. I mean, Guilford Courthouse is one of the most impressive tactical victories in my mind, in the entirety of the 18th century world. Earl Cornwallis is there. He's outnumbered 2-1. He breaks through 3 enemy prepared defensive lines. I mean, this is just an incredible feat of arms. But it also takes a ton of casualties. And his army has to withdraw to Wilmington to the coast to refit after the battle's done. And so you win fighting that if you're an average British soldier like Roger Lamb and you're seeing the officers lead from the front in inspiring ways, you're pumped up and you say, wow, isn't this an impressive achievement? But it's not fulfilling the strategic aims of the British, which is to bring the colonies back in line. And so, much as we found in the Vietnam War, winning the battles doesn't necessarily mean you win the war. And this is to some extent, if you think that the Americans losing the War of Independence is a tragedy, as you gents might. I don't know. I don't. I rather like America, and I like the UK as well. And I'm excited to hear President Trump saying maybe we'll join the Commonwealth now. I think it's a fascinating development in the course of American-British relations. We'll see what happens. This is a story I think that gives, you know, like the Americans of Vietnam, there are a lot of tactical battles that are fun to study. The British win. That doesn't necessarily lead to political objectives or strategic objectives being fulfilled.
It is Liam's mic, but I do just want to say it took you 250 years, but we always knew you were going to come back.
Yeah, we love you all too much. Yeah, yeah.
Too right.
Well, if there was ever an answer that deserved a 5-star review, that was it. Thank you very much, Alex. Please go to your podcast providers and leave us a review, 5 stars. It really does help. But I just want to take us now, Alex, towards wrap. And I guess, what do you want to change off the back of this book? Both in terms of people's perceptions of 18th century warfare, particularly infantry warfare, but also in terms of where the research into this will go next.
Absolutely. It's a great question. So, first of all, I would say if books like mine and Matt Spring's get into enough hands that we can change the perception that 18th century armies were kind of like soulless robots kind of marching blithely into gunfire getting annihilated by their opponents like robots. This is I'll be deeply pleased. And say if we get another film depiction of 18th century battle in the course of the 250th anniversaries that shows maybe the more flexible and adaptable way that these armies are actually fighting on the battlefield, I'll be best pleased. It's not a terribly academic goal. But maybe like Christopher Duffy, I'm not just writing for other academics. I'm really writing for reenactors and war gamers. I think an important part of the historian's job is to connect with the popular audience. And so, I mean, in my field, that is reenactors. It is war gamers. I don't think of those as groups that academic historians should ignore. I think we've got to try and reach these folks, give them the best information possible so they can represent the period to the best of their ability. With that said, as far as next steps, I mean, in the book, I really sort of put out a call in a couple of ways. I think we need historians who are be more linguistically gifted than I, people who have a great grasp of things like Polish and Swedish and Italian to go in and geographically widen the scope and take it forwards and backwards in time. My book argues essentially, right, on the battlefields of the 18th century, ordinary enlisted men took cover. They like to avoid melee. They ran on the battlefield, especially to sort of get out of the line of fire. I would love to see research suggesting this isn't just a mid-18th century phenomenon. This is something that we could identify from maybe the adoption of firearms by European armies on. What is the whole global story of man's experience on the battlefield with firearms from their adoption to the present in terms of a perspective from the lower ranks, from enlisted men, as far as we can get that. That is where I'd love to see more research down the line, trying to bring in these wars that maybe are less familiar to us in English. I think is something that my book I'm very proud of that achievement. I have starting the story in northern Italy at the battles of Parma and Gusula. I've been shocked by how many Italian historians have reached out to me and said, wow, thanks for not forgetting about us in the rush to get to Frederick the Great and sort of other more important figures like, or not more important, but other figures like George Washington, who are more well known to an English language audience. So I've been deeply gratified by that. But yeah, trying to take a more broad geographic focus, trying to expand, this story of maybe battle from below in time. I think these are ways I'd love to see the field go in the next 20 years as research continues on these subjects.
Alex, if that wasn't an advert and an indication of why people need to go and buy the book, then frankly I don't know what is going to induce people. You couldn't have done a better job. Thank you so much for your time. Folks, you've been listening to Dr. Alex Burns, Assistant Professor of History at Franciscan University of Steubenville, or should it be Steubenville? We will.
It should be, yeah.
Okay. Folks, Infantry in Battle 1733 to 1783 is available from hellion.co.uk. We will put a link in the description. And while you're there, I can't tell you that, Hellion are going to do sort of buy one, get one half price, but, at least this means that Alex might actually see tuppence halfpenny out of the meager royalties that authors get for writing history books. But also get your hands on the changing face of old regime warfare essays in honor of Christopher Duffy, which is also from Hellion. And if you are loving the 18th Century Way of War series, then you're going to want to go and listen to the Prime and Load podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. And when you get there, you are going to leave a 5-star review. Please and thank you. Be nice. But make sure you've actually listened to a couple of episodes first, but then give it a 5-star review. That's just a given. Alex, always a joy to have you on. Thank you so much for your time.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks so much, gents.
This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. What did you think of this episode? If you're listening on Spotify, you can now post your questions and comments, and we'll get back to you. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late March 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schrager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, Daniel Friedman, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.